안녕하세요. 돈과 정신 건강의 완벽한 조화를 목표로 한 머니앤마인드에 오신 것을 환영합니다. 지난 에피소드에서 우리는 나스닥 24,000과 S&P 7,000이라는 충격적인 시장 예측을 다루었고, 멜트업 직후의 대붕괴 가능성에 대해서도 이야기했습니다. 이제 다가오는 금융붕괴와 경기 침체가 우리 경제에 미칠 영향을 더 깊이 파헤쳐 볼 시간입니다. 파트 2에서는 금과 은 같은 귀금속 시장에 집중해 향후 몇 년 동안 어떻게 귀금속 가격이 역사적 고점에 도달할 것인지, 그리고 글로벌 붕괴가 우리 눈앞에서 어떻게 펼쳐질 것인지 구체적으로 예측할 예정입니다. 특히 2025년에 닥쳐올 디플레이션 붕괴와 그 후 다시 시작될 거대한 인플레이션 사이클을 설명드리겠습니다. 어떻게 금 가격이 달러, 은 가격이 달러까지 치솟을 가능성이 있는지 꼭 끝까지 시청해주세요. 데이비드, 명확하게 하기 위해서 질문드리는데 2025년, 내년 말쯤 말씀하시는 건가요? 왜냐하면 전 에피소드에서 2025년과 2026년을 언급하셨잖아요. 그래서 내년 말쯤에 붕괴가 올 거라고 생각하시는 건지 여쭤보는 겁니다.
No, well, I think the bust is probably could start anytime in 25. I think the bottom of the bust is probably late next year, but I think you'll be in a bust most of next year. That seems crazy to be in a melt up months before the bust starts, but nobody's looking at a bust right now. Like I said, that can come fast, and it's possible it takes more time, and it's more mid year before it gets going. But I think you could have a bust as early as first or second quarter next year. Yeah. So I would not be surprised if we're in recession already, because there are certain parts of the economy that are certainly struggling. So it's not so crazy to say that you could even see the bust start, early in 2025, because if you're already in a weak spot, it just tips over into something worse. And of course, that's the U.S. I think the bust is probably going to be triggered by events outside the U.S. because the European banks are very, very much weaker than our banks, or have some potential problems. Canada's in worse shape than we are this time. Last time Canada was great. Their banks were in really good shape, and they didn't learn the lessons of what we went through, and they look like our banks now. Our banks of back then. Their real estate's extended and looks like it's problematic. So I think things can come unwound quickly is all I'm saying. So, but I don't worry too much about when is that going to happen. We'll find it as we get there. All I know is that for the next several months, meaning the balance of this year or certainly the next few months, the stock market is not going to be bothered by anything. I don't think. I think there's enough of evidence that this economy is holding together that people will be focused on the fact that the Fed's easing, that rates are coming down, that the dollar is starting to fall, and that China's back on board. China's finally easing again. So you got global liquidity is starting to lift. That's also a bullish sign.
조마조마한 투자가면 지금 당장 시장에 들어가지 않을 것 같아요. 왜냐하면 사람들은 항상 고점과 저점을 정확하게 맞추지 못하잖아요. 조마조마한 투자가면 끝이 다가오고 있다고 생각할 겁니다. 그리고 저도 당신의 말에 동의합니다. 이 파티를 계속 이어가면서 금리를 계속 낮출 수는 없잖아요. 어느 순간에 가면 다 무너질 겁니다.
Yep, and we've gotten there from leverage. I mean, China's found that out. Their whole so-called miracle of the last cycle was really debt. I mean, they just blew their debt way up, and it was a great party, but they ran into the problems. Now you got the hangover, and they're struggling to figure out what to do with that hangover because a lot of it's real estate, and their consumers aren't spending, and I think they're really finally at a point where they're saying, this is kind of what I'm saying we're going to be at next year. We didn't want to have to go back here, but our economy's not going to respond unless we print some more money, unless we do some of these easing things. So I think they're feeling like they don't have a choice because their economy's starting to really, they're seeing deflation, as you know. So, and by the way, the global bust I talk about next year, I think it will be a global, and again, this is a global, not just U.S., a global deflationary bust. So I think we'll actually have deflation next year.
지금 귀금속 시장이 이를 인식하고 있다고 보시나요? 지금 금 가격은 사상 최고치를 기록하고 있지만 은 가격은 아직 따라오지 못했어요. 원자재 시장은 전혀 따라잡지 못했어요. 그런데 금은 마치 수정구슬을 들여다보고 있는 것 같아요. 우리는 괜찮을 거야. 귀금속 시장은 안전해. 라는 신호를 주는 것처럼 보이지만 다른 모든 것들은 엉망이 될 것 같습니다.
Yeah, I think gold and silver look great. I wanna just say one last thing because I think I confused you and I probably confused the audience. Um, the 26 to 30 dates that I threw out there, that is not the global bust. That is the next recovery. The bust only lasts maybe a year, 12 to 18 months. So by the second half of 2026, we should be in a new recovery. Why are we going to be in a new recovery? Because the Fed will have printed $20 trillion and every other central bank will have printed similar, proportionally similar. So that money will trigger a recovery, but it'll also trigger a huge inflation cycle. And that's why I say oil to 500. And I'll just throw out a couple more since we're talking about gold and silver. My target for gold and silver by the end of this decade or early next decade, gold 20,000, silver 500.
엄청난 예측이네요. 그건 제임스 리카드의 예측보다도 더 높습니다.
Oh yeah, no, we are going to see an inflation cycle that is going to go beyond anything we've seen, beyond the early 80s. I was here in the late 70s, early 80s when the US saw 20% inflation. I think by the early next decade, if not late this decade, we could be looking at 25% inflation in this country. So you'll be dealing with whatever yours is going to be proportionally to that. We're going to have a massive inflation cycle. And it's, so commodities will be the story once we get beyond the bust, but everything's going to get hit in the bust. So you can't straight line it from here. My targets, I'll back up and say my gold target for during this melt up between now and the end of the first quarter of 2025, I just raised my target on gold from 3,000, which I had 10 months ago when we talked. I just raised it to 3,400. So that's where I think gold's going in the next 6 months.
모두 듣고 계시죠? 정말 집중하셔야 합니다. 데이비드가 방금 말씀하신 것처럼 그는 이 시장에 50년 이상 몸담아 왔습니다. 그는 시장의 사이클을 이해하고 있고 시장과 반대 의견을 가질 때 자본을 보존하고 심지어 늘릴 수 있다는 것을 잘 알고 있습니다. 여러분 모두가 자본을 보존하고 늘릴 수 있기를 바랍니다. 그리고 자본을 다 잃어버렸어 라고 말하지 않기를 바랍니다. 이런 시기에는 자본을 보존하고 늘려야 합니다. 그러니 이분 같은 사람들의 말을 듣되 자신의 결정을 신중히 내리세요. 데이비드, 계속 말씀해 주세요.
So gold to 3,400. Silver, I had a 60 target on that when we last talked. I raised that in July to 75. So I'm looking for silver between now and the end of the first quarter of next year to go to 75. We're down at 32 now. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a short-term pullback here, back just under 30. And we may not, but I wouldn't be surprised by that. But then I think it's pretty fast run to 75 in the next 3 to 6 months.
죄송한데 금 가격도 조금 하락할 가능성이 있다고 보시나요? 사람들이 그렇게 말하더라고요.
It doesn't have to. I'm sorry. Doesn't have to, but I wouldn't be surprised if you got $100 pullback in gold. You're not going to do a lot. I mean, you're not going to go from we're almost 2,700. You could go back or 26 something. You could go back to 2,500. I think at the most. You might not get back much below 2,550 or 2,575, but whatever pullback is going to be short lived. And it may not. We may just be in the go period for both metals. But it does look to me like I could see 29.5 on the silver chart. I don't know if we'll do it, but I can see it. And if we do that, then it'll be a quick run from there, up over 40 and keep going.
맞아요. 많은 사람들이 금 가격이 너무 비싸다고 말하는데 저는 그들에게 항상 이렇게 말합니다. 당신들이 놓치는 게 있어요. 금이 비싼 게 아니라 당신이 사용하는 종이 돈의 구매력이 생각하는 것보다 더 빨리 떨어지고 있는 겁니다.
And precisely, the gold in other currencies has done a lot better than gold in the U.S. over the last several years. So now it's the U.S. dollar's turn to fall out of bed, and I'm calling for the dollar, which is down around 100, 100 and a half, to go to 80. And that's between now and probably second quarter next year. So that's what I think. That's why I can be so bullish on the metals. Other currencies, gold may not do as well, but in the U.S. dollar, gold's in its sweet spot right now. Is going to keep going.
네, 시간이 다 되어 가는데요. 오늘 말씀해 주신 내용이 많습니다. 멜트업, 붕괴, 그리고 2026년에서 2030년은 회복기라는 점을 분명히 하셨죠. 하지만 글로벌 디플레이션을 겪은 후 다시 엄청난 인플레이션이 찾아올 것이라는 점을 강조하셨습니다. 앞으로 사람들이 해야 할 3가지를 말씀해 주시면 좋겠어요. 참고로 10개월은 너무 긴 시간입니다. 우리가 12월에 다시 대화할 수 있다면 좋겠습니다. 그때까지 상황이 많이 변할 것 같아서요. 바쁘신 줄 알지만 12월에 다시 이야기를 나눌 수 있기를 부탁드립니다.
I'd be glad to do that. So I'm not going to give 3 action points because it'd be advice. But what I can say, it gives me a chance to go back and say, we're in a unique period where the returns I'm talking about over the next 3 or 4 or 5 months are returns that you would normally take 2 or 3 years to get. Particularly in the Russell 2000, if it goes up 50% in 3 or 4 or 5 months, 50% would be returns you might get over 3 or 4 years normally. So even though we're within a few months of a top, and I would normally say nobody's smart enough to pick a top, and you're better off being early than late, and those are all true. I also think you have to factor in the fact that we're in a period, unlike in my 51 years, I've never seen a period like this. The closest thing was the NASDAQ run up in 99, 2000, a parabolic run. But we're about to see a historic parabolic rally that I think may be the biggest in history. And so, kind of going back to what I said before, you could come out now and it'd be prudent to say I'm either pretty hedged or I'm out because I can't be that smart to pick the top, and then see 30 or 40% that you missed and feel you got to scramble and get in, and then you catch the top and ride it down. So you just have to understand that dynamic, I think, is the first and foremost. And some people will be very nimble and be able to stay bullish and do it all right. The other corollary or the other connection to that same statement is you don't want to be late, because the other side of the mountain is going to be equally steep. I'm calling you, if I'm right about an 80% bear market, it'll probably happen over 8 to 10 months. You'll have, a big step down where you're down 30, 40% or more, and then a big counter trend rally that gives, catches back half of that loss, and then another big leg down to lower lows and maybe a third leg down. So I'm guessing it'll be, a big part of next year, 8 to 10 months of next year, you'll see that. So, but that's pretty fast. I mean, and you're going to feel like, look at the tech sell off, look at the semi sell off of the last few months. That should give you some idea of how quick things can go the other way. Everything looked great, and then all of a sudden you go, wow, I just lost 40% of my semi position. So just understand that we're in a very unusual, and that's what happens at the end of a 42-year cycle, is things get very volatile.